Today on The Real Story, reducing gun violence in Connecticut cities. The mayors of Hartford, Waterbury, New Haven, and Bridgeport standing in solidarity, saying more needs to be done to hold repeat offenders accountable. This morning, Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin speaks out in support of a bill that he and other mayors believe will do just that. His thoughts first up this morning. And in today's committee close-up, we are sitting down with leaders of the Human Services Committee, their priorities for this legislative session, the proposals they're making to help drive down your health care costs, and how they plan to get better resources for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Good morning, and thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Jenn Bernstein. Well, gun violence is a problem that's not going away, and Connecticut cities know its toll far too well. A large amount of that violence is perpetuated by a small group of people, repeat offenders, and the data supports this. For example, in Hartford, of the 44 people arrested in 2022 for fatal and non-fatal shootings, 58% were on pretrial release, probation, or parole. From 2019 to 2021, among both victims of gun violence and suspects in gun violence cases, 70% had prior felony records. And when Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin was president of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, he convened a task force to develop solutions for strengthening accountability by repeat offenders. Those recommendations were rolled out last month with support from Mayor Bronin, Mayor Justin Elliker of New Haven, Mayor Neil O'Leary of Waterbury, and Mayor Joe Ganim of Bridgeport, leadership in Connecticut's largest cities. Well, those proposals are now in a bill that's supported by gun violence prevention groups and Governor Ned Lamont himself. A public hearing on this and several other gun proposals held at the Capitol last week. So we want to talk about some of those proposals with Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin this morning. Great to have you back on the program.
Thanks for having me on, Jen.
Okay, so this kind of started with you because when you were heading up CCM for the 2 years, you convened this task force. What made you feel like this was necessary?
Look, I think all of the mayors involved in this thought it was necessary. We've been talking about this problem for a while. I think in all of our cities that see devastating levels of gun violence, we see the same thing happening all too often, which is individuals with an extensive criminal record, often of violent crime, remain involved in serious firearm activity. And as you said in the data you just presented, a significant number of those who are actively involved in gun violence are out on pretrial release. That means out on bail, are out on probation, and in some instances parole. The stats in Waterbury were 70% either on pretrial release or on probation. And so what we wanted to do was fashion a proposal that focuses squarely on that issue, that says if you have a history of serious offenses, including violent offenses or firearm offenses, and then you're picked up with a ghost gun or with a gun that's been altered to obliterate a serial number or turned it into a fully automatic weapon or a stolen firearm, that you then face higher consequences. And that means, for example, you got to post a higher percentage of your bail. And if you're out on bail or if you're on probation or parole, that there are swift and sure consequences as a result of your actions. On the bail issue, I think it's important for people to recognize that in Connecticut, you only have to post a small fraction of the bail that's required by the court. And so we're saying if you've got that serious record and you're picked up with a new serious firearm offense, you've got to post a higher percentage of it, and you can't finance it through a bondsman. And we think that's a really important element. But again, there are 10 parts of this proposal.
Yes.
We think all of them are important.
Yeah, you just said one of them: require individuals with a history of certain past offenses to post that higher percentage of their bond when arrested on a new serious firearm offense. Also establishing a definition of serious firearm offense. That's kind of an interesting one. That results in an increased accountability when committed by someone with a serious criminal history. Why is that important?
Well, again, we're trying to say if you've got that record and then you have what we've categorized as a new serious firearm offense, and I just listed some of them, but that's possession of a ghost gun, possession of a stolen weapon, actually shooting somebody, or brandishing a weapon and threatening to shoot somebody, then that should count as a new serious firearm offense that carries greater accountability, greater consequence.
This is obviously strengthening your accountability of these people who are out and doing this and had gotten in trouble previously, right? And I know that an article I was reading, you all were saying that this is tackling gun violence is a multi-pronged approach. It's not just about punishment, right? But this aspect, you feel like the punishment needs to be stronger.
That's a hugely important part of it, and I appreciate you saying it.
Sure.
We've been very clear from the start. This is just one piece of a broader, comprehensive approach to gun violence reduction. And that includes a lot of prevention work. That needs to include increased and sustained support for community violence prevention efforts, for things like hospital-based violence intervention, for the violence interruption work that helps de-escalate disputes and prevent the cycle of violence, for things like our Reentry Welcome Center, which helps make sure that people who are coming back to our community after having served time get the support and connection to resources that they need, and a great deal more. I'm happy to talk for a full hour about all the things that we're doing and that need to be done to make prevention efforts more effective. But we do believe that this set of proposals is a critical piece of any comprehensive approach to reducing gun violence.
How much of a difference could this make?
We think it would make a huge difference. I mean, again, in Hartford, 39% of the people arrested last year for shooting somebody were out on bail when they did it. And it cannot be so easy to remain involved in that kind of activity and remain in the community. I hear not just from law enforcement, but from our community, their frustration because they know individuals who are involved in this stuff. Our community knows who's out there pulling triggers, and when they see individuals who are involved in that activity repeatedly, who are arrested, and then are back out in the community too quickly, it's painful. It's enormously frustrating and difficult for our partners out there who are doing the work of violence interruption. Of course, it's frustrating for law enforcement, but it's also really frustrating for the community that just wants to have a safe community, and everybody deserves that.
Sure. So we had the public hearing on this bill. Senator Gary Winfield, who's been on our program many times before, felt like the bill was too broad, he was saying during this. Do you think that it's too broad, the language?
Look, obviously, our coalition worked hard to craft a proposal that we support. I support the language as drafted, but this is a legislative process. There's always going to be give and take, to the extent that Senator Winfield or any other legislator thinks that there are ways that it can be more appropriately tailored and still achieve the result. We're ready to work and partner together. I know that Senator Winfield cares deeply about the safety of his community, and I'm eager to work together with anybody who wants to help address this problem in as effective a way as we can.
Interestingly, there were several gun bills that were brought up in that hearing. Governor Lamont has a couple of them. And you had testified that any kind of new gun control laws were pointless without action being taken against repeat offenders. That's an interesting point.
Well, look, to me, it's pretty straightforward. I do believe in common sense gun laws. I think that we need to make sure that ghost guns are prohibited and we eliminate loopholes, that high-capacity magazines are treated seriously and we eliminate loopholes. But if we're going to do those things, we also have to make sure that if people repeatedly break those laws, there are real consequences for doing so.
And interestingly, you have Governor Lamont's support on this. I mean, he was saying he supports it. He also said that he did not feel like it rolled back on the criminal justice reforms that the state had recently in the last couple of years put in place. How important is that support going to be? You still got to get it through the legislature, though, right?
Sure. And I think, we all appreciate the governor's support of this proposal. I'm also really appreciative of the community support. We had a number of organizations that stood with us that are out there doing this work. They're out there doing the work of trying to save lives by preventing gun violence, by whether it's supporting victims of gun violence to try to break the cycle, whether it's about working with young people to try to help them get on a different path. So, and we also have the support of a lot of families who have experienced the grief from gun violence firsthand. But I do think that we're ready to work with anybody who wants to sit down with us to try to get something done here. And I'm hopeful that we will do something, because this really is critical to addressing this problem that so many cities around the country and here in Connecticut are facing.
I mean, you have a lot of momentum with, even the gov, and then the mayors of all of these cities, obviously including you, saying that this is something that would help all of us and the community support as well. What was the feedback that you got after the hearing?
Look, I think there are a lot of people who support this, and we've got many months to go in the legislative session.
Sure.
This is when the work gets done. We're eager to do that work in partnership.
Okay. And, you have only a little while left in office, so we have to talk about that. A couple months, and then you're going to be leaving the seat that you've held, we were just talking, for 8 years. Yeah. Hard to believe, because I remember having you on the program when Al Terzi and I were co-anchoring, and, it was all about fiscal reform and tackling crime was what you had campaigned on at first. And we remember talking about coming on and seeing how tough Hartford's finances were, and that was what you were first tasked with. I remember talking about getting under the hood of the car with you, and you were like, it's bad right now.
It was bad.
Let's reflect back on where...
it feels like a lifetime ago in some ways. But look, when my team and I took office, the city was bankrupt. It was not legally in bankruptcy, but the city was bankrupt. It was insolvent with oceans of red ink in the years ahead. And I'm proud of the way that we tackled that. We tackled it head on, honestly, and we said at the time, we're not just going to buy time. We're not just going to kick the can. We're going to try to lay a solid foundation. And we did that in a bunch of ways. We made some really difficult decisions and really difficult cuts. We asked our unions to come to the table in some big ways, and they did. We asked our corporations to come to the table, and they did in some big ways. And of course, we partnered with the state of Connecticut with a really important, meaningful partnership that helped make it possible to lay that foundation. And then in the years since, we've worked really hard to make sure that we were delivering on our commitment of fiscal responsibility. And I'd stack our record and our team's record up against any town, any city in the state and beyond. We've budgeted with rigor. We've managed carefully. We've been extremely disciplined. We haven't borrowed a dollar. We're continuing to do that work. We passed the largest tax cut in 3 decades last year to deliver some property tax relief. But I will say that work has to be protected. That progress is fragile. And there are still threats. Coming out of the pandemic, commercial office market is at risk. There's been a huge hit to the commercial real estate market, and that's a big part of our tax base. So we're going to have to continue to stay focused. Whoever takes this seat after me is going to have to remain disciplined. But my pledge to myself and to my team and to our city was that we were going to do everything possible to make sure that when it came time to pass that baton, that the next mayor, the next administration was taking over a city that was in as strong and sound a fiscal condition as possible.
Yeah, big turnaround from when you kind of first took office here. Have you thrown your support behind anyone?
No. As you know, there are a number of people in the race right now.
Yeah,
we've got a long way to go, and I'm obviously watching with an awful lot of interest, both as mayor and just as a resident of the city who loves the city. I reserve the right to get involved at some point, but at this point, I'm just watching the campaigns go on.
How about this? Do you feel optimistic about the candidates who are in the race so far?
Let me just say, I feel enormously optimistic about the city of Hartford and about the direction that we've set and about the potential of keeping that momentum going. And I think whoever takes office is going to have their work cut out for them, as anybody in this seat will. But I look forward to partnering with whoever the people choose, and in the meantime, continuing to do everything possible to make sure that this city is as strong and as healthy and has as much energy and momentum and economic development activity happening as possible.
Okay, biggest piece of advice for the next person taking over your seat?
I think 2 things.
Okay.
First, when we first took office, I said to my team, in every decision we make, we're going to follow the next mayor rule. And what I meant by that was everything that we have to do, we're going to ask, how would the next mayor feel about this decision? Not what about us right now? Is it easy for us? But is this the right thing? Is it the right thing for the long term? Because there were a lot of things that I looked back and said, man, I wish they'd done that differently. Yep. And I hope that the next administration takes that same approach. The second thing is that, as you know, we went through some really challenging times, not just the fiscal crisis when I started, but the pandemic. And I think a lot of times people and maybe politicians underestimate a community or the people's willingness to hear bad news. And in my experience, if you are honest about a problem and you lay out why you think something and why it makes sense, and you get out there and just have the tough conversations directly, that community, number one, will rally behind that, understands it, respects it. And so I would say the next administration, don't be afraid of tough decisions. Don't be afraid of tough conversations. I hope that that's how our team is governed. It's certainly how we've tried.
Yep, okay. And if the community was receptive to that, that's a good piece of advice. Do you know what's next?
No, I don't know
Not
what's
yet.
next.
You got
No.
some time. You got some time. And we can actually watch all of those interviews if you want with the candidates for Hartford Mayor on fox61.com and streaming, because we've interviewed most of them at this point, or a bunch of them. All right, Mayor Luke Bronin, thanks so much for coming on The Real Story and talking about the bill that you have in the legislature right now, and of course, reflecting on your time in office. We'll have you on again, though, as you near your end of term, so we can talk more about it.
Thanks so much, Jen.
All right, thank you. All right, that's going to do it for this segment of The Real Story. But coming up, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Human Services Committee. What are those lawmakers looking at when it comes to potential new laws? Co-chair of the Human Services Committee, Senator Matt Lesser, and ranking member Representative Jay Case joining us to discuss prescription costs, health care access, support for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, just to name a few. So stay with us. This committee close-up is on its way.